over 4 to make sure that everybody's gotten a chance to share. So what did I say? Timekeeper, facilitator, a recorder, somebody to write notes and take notes on what's happening and who's saying what, and then a reporter, somebody to share back what the group came up with. And you can merge some of those, like I didn't bother with recorders for this week. We just had a reporter to kind of pull things together, and I thought you guys did that very well as a group. But in a live setting, or maybe it's not live, in an in-person setting, face-to-face setting, you might want to have more of those roles, especially a timekeeper and somebody to record things and then someone different to report. And that also gives you just a little more transparency too. It takes a little power away from the person reporting, because the person reporting theoretically can say or share anything they want. They can share their opinion instead of what the group came away with. But if you have somebody recording things that the whole group said and then somebody reporting, it kind of puts it through a couple people, so you can make sure it's a balanced perspective. So that is kind of what I wanted to touch on with week 3. Okay, so moving on to week 4. As I said, week 4 we're looking at dialectics and digging into face saving as one of the dialectics. Your readings really give, I think, a good background on what these dialectics are. If you aren't familiar, I know some of you have done some work or understand these different dialectics. But just to go over briefly which ones we're particularly looking at this week, we're going to look at individualism versus collectivism. So this is the idea. Traditionally, we look at Westerners as individualistic, thinking of self, putting self first. This competitive idea of I want to win by myself comes from an individualistic point of view. Collectivism is also a cultural thing on the other side of this spectrum. And things you see in a collectivistic culture is needing to make decisions with family in mind, or even with family. This becomes particularly interesting. I know at least one of you mentioned you took the 40-hour mediation course. One thing in mediation that I find interesting, and I like to pose to people who are looking at intercultural mediation, is when we mediate, the mediation process that we use tends to be within an individualistic society. So you have two people that are having an argument or a dispute about something, and you're working with each person to kind of come to terms and listen to the other. But in a collectivistic culture, you could go through that process with one person on each side, and if one of those people is from a collectivistic culture, they can leave and have not fully committed to any of the decisions made in the mediation, because they need to talk with their family first. Their family needs to make a decision together. They don't take the ball and run with it necessarily. There are also examples of people who, a woman who wanted to be a doctor or wanted to travel, but because she was from a collectivistic background, she chose not to do that. Her parents didn't want her to. And it wasn't necessarily that her parents were holding her back. She just made a decision for the family or for the community above a decision for something she wanted personally or individually. So that's really the kind of spectrum we're looking at there, individualism and collectivism. The other one is high context, low context. And this is a pretty complex dialectic, as the face-saving one is, as we saw in our text reading. But high context and low context, the ideas behind that are, what's the word? High context would be a sense of communicating with a lot of nonverbal communication. So you're drawing a lot of what you're communicating or what you're understanding from somebody's behaviors, from their position in society, whether they're a man or a woman. Not a lot is said directly, whereas a low context culture doesn't leave much to be interpreted. It's more verbal, it's more verbatim. What I'm saying to you is exactly what I want you to understand. I don't need you to understand who I am or my position or anything else. So that's our low context and high context. Something that kind of folds in with that is this idea of power distance. An example of power distance would be in some cultures there is a very formalized setting around, or formalized hierarchy in the business place. So I've heard a story of a time when an American man went to Japan and he was doing business there, and he wanted to have lunch with a Japanese businessman, and he kept on calling the secretary or asking the secretary if they could have lunch. And the Japanese businessman was offended that he would talk directly to the secretary and not to him, because that was part of the just this formal business setting. Who you talk to speaks volumes, and that's where we get back into the high context understanding of it. The face saving we'll dig into a little bit more, and one of our one of our discussion threads this week, I'm going to have you watch a video of The Office, the UK version of The Office, and kind of draw out some of these different face saving contexts. So, let's see here. In our reading, we see all of these different types of face: autonomy face, inclusion face, approval face, reliability face, competence face, and moral face. And the text goes into what these all mean. But they're also pretty self-explanatory, right? Autonomy face means the need to be seen as autonomous, the need to be seen as independent, self-sufficient, that sort of thing. So what I'll have you do is kind of dissect the clip that we show for the face saving, the types of face saving you see going on, and those that you don't see going on. This example, I was when I was watching it earlier today, I realized that part of the funniness of The Office, whether it's the UK version or the United States version, is that there's no face saving, right? Everybody's embarrassed. Everybody, nobody gives anybody an inch in anything, and that's what makes it so awkward and funny. So there's also very little face saving going on. So I ask you, if you don't see certain types of face, and that might be because it's a comedy, to dig into that and say, well, in reality, I kind of think this type of face would be appropriate in this culture. And you can look at your own culture, or you can look at other cultures and kind of anticipate the type of face saving you think would be seen in that type of culture. Let's see. Oh, the other thing that I did this week is I posted an exercise. I call it the intercultural negotiation. I've adapted it from the CTAR book. I can't remember exactly which one it is, but I can get you the reference if you'd like it. But what it is just two different types of cultures that are on very different sides of these various dialectical scales, including individualistic and collectivistic, including high context and low context. And so what I'll have you do this week is look at that as an example of training methods for understanding and learning on the dialectics. And what I'd like you to do in the discussion board